Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a well known and accomplished entrepreneur and an author from Dubai, UAE, Mr. Sangeet Paul Choudhary. Sangeet, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Sangeet is an author of a book titled Reshuffle, and we'll be talking about his book today. He's also a co author of a book titled Platform Revolution. He has advised CEOs at more than 40 Fortune 500 companies, as well as pre IPO tech firms. He's currently a senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and has presented at leading global forums, including the G20 Summit, the World 50 Summit, and the World Economic Forum. So, Sangeet, before we come to your book, how did your early career experiences shape your thinking about technology as a force of coordination rather than just automation?
Well, I think, I was sort of fortunate to be part of that generation that graduated just around the time that the true potential of the internet was coming through. So
Mm,
I completed my engineering in 2004, joined the workforce in 2006 after my MBA. And I started my career in tech firms, and I repeatedly saw people trying to make sense of what was happening, but looking at very linear and uh, you know um, localized ways of thinking about what was changing. So I'll
mm,
give a couple of examples. One of the dominant ways of thinking about tech at that time was that we're moving from offline to online. So it was seen as just a channel shift, or it was Yahoo, where I started my career, saw the internet as a media company. So it was just like the traditional media business, but it was just online instead of offline. And uh, I just felt that there was something much bigger happening, which was being missed. That there was a much larger shift happening. I could see companies like Alibaba and a few other, early players around that time who were fundamentally different, and that's what really drove me to
mm,
think about what's fundamentally different about what the internet is doing. And 6 years on into my career, I quit my corporate roles to pursue this full time. And essentially, my key thesis from the beginning has been that technology doesn't just change your channel or your execution. It changes the way economic activity and even social activity is organized completely. And those new reorganized forms of activity that emerge, understanding that early and latching onto that or betting on that, that's where the real value lies. And that's really what's underpinned my work.
great response. Thank you. Sangeet, you also become one of the foremost thinkers on platform economics and digital ecosystems. Tell me a little bit more about this and what drew you to this field.
Yeah, so the central question that's kind of guided my curiosity from the beginning, and I would say that my career has been very curiosity first. The moment I stop seeing curiosity as the leading indicator of what's driving my work, I start losing energy, losing interest. So I've been blessed to be living in a time when curiosity is rewarded versus
Mm,
20, 30 years back when it would have been less rewarded. But what really, the guiding question that's kind of driven me is that whenever technological shifts happen, whether it's the internet or eventually, data driven technologies or, the rise of APIs, AI, etc., whenever there's a technological shift that's happening, what determines the new winners and losers? It's not as easy as saying fundamentally new companies will win and the incumbents will lose. It's not as easy as saying that if the incumbents have ABC properties, they're always going to win. So what exactly determines new winners and losers?
mm,
And this is where I wanted to articulate exactly what was changing back in the early 2010s.
mm,
And that's by looking at everything that was happening, I realized that fundamentally what was changing is that all forms of activity online and all forms of activity once digitized were reorganized as new markets of activity. So if I give a few simple examples, if you go to a regular store, you walk into the store, you buy something, and you come out, and the store has data about you, but they're not using that to spur new activity. But Amazon uses the same data, and it says people who bought this also bought this. So it's reorganized market activity, right? And so how data can be used to reorganize market activity, how a company like Airbnb used, a reputation and rating system to reorganize activity between strangers. These are the things that were catching my fascination at that point. And what underpins all of them is this shift from traditional models, which I call pipeline models, create something, push it out, sell it, to platform models, which is connect, exchange with different stakeholders and create value together. And the platform essentially benefits from all the activity that's happening on that basis. So that's what really underpinned the first body of work that I created during the 2010s.
Fascinating. Let's come to your book now, Reshuffle. Uh, the title Reshuffle is quite an intriguing title. What does it signify in the context of the knowledge economy? And what was the hypothesis when you decided to write this book?
Yeah, I think, Reshuffle as a title is very close to my heart, because even before I wrote this book, I've always been trying to answer this question of what determines the new winners and losers. And my point over there is that the fundamental thing that determines the new winners and losers is that the playing field itself changes, the game itself changes. So if you just look at what's happening based on the logic of the previous game, if you just say, well, things used to work offline and now things will work online, so just apply the same logic, you'll miss out on who's really going to be the new winners and losers. So the new winners and losers are really determined by first understanding how is the primary competitive game in the industry, and even how are the boundaries of the industry fundamentally changing once different forces, whether technological, today even more so geopolitical and regulatory, once all these forces change the way the industry or the playing field works. So I'll just give a few very simple examples that everybody should be able to associate with. Social networks in the mid 2010s were supposed to have been a game that had clear winners, because you had YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, companies with very strong what we call network effects. The more people join on, the more there's value in the system. And so all of these players were set up around the idea of a social graph, which was that you had to follow somebody in order to see value. Instagram, YouTube, whichever example you take.
Yeah.
And what helped these companies be successful, the logic of winners and losers, was that in order for somebody to create a competitor, the competitor would have to would need all the users to move their entire social graph to the new platform, and that was prohibitive. And that's why Wall Street had declared that you can't really beat these companies at social networking. Well, what happened is that as AI capabilities improved, TikTok came up with a fundamentally new way to organize social networking without requiring a social graph in the first place. So what TikTok does is it structures activity around a behavior graph. It instead of requiring you to follow somebody, it captures so much data about your interactions with different videos that it's able to build a profile about you. And the way it captures that data is it made the video less than maximum 60 seconds. It allowed multiple videos which essentially enabled multiple videos to be seen in a single session by the user. And because it was mobile first, it could track every single thing you were doing with the video on the screen of the mobile phone. So the fact that we moved to improving AI capabilities alongside the rise of 4G connectivity, which allowed a video first, mobile first social network to be created, that changed the logic of the game. Suddenly, you could create a social network for the first time without building a social graph. And that helped TikTok beat these players, because it totally changed the rules of the game. So that's really the idea of a reshuffle, that in order to see the new winners and losers, you need to see how the game is changing. And the game changes because the dominant assumption of the previous game suddenly becomes irrelevant.
Well said. And thank you for explaining this to me. I also often wonder what did TikTok do differently, and you give me a great explanation for that. Sangeet, you describe AI's power as coordination, not cognition.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack what that means in simple terms?
Yeah, absolutely. Because today we have all the top model companies, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, all of them shouting from the rooftops, saying 1 month that you have the intelligence of a fifth grader in your pocket, and 2 months later you have the intelligence of five PhDs in your pocket. So
Correct.
everybody is thinking about AI in terms of intelligence, and they're using these metaphors of, which level of intelligence are we talking about? And that's not really what matters when we think about the impact of technology on our economy and our society. If we look
Mm.
at the history of technology, it's not about how performant the technology is. And the reason the performance piece is important is because even the detractors of AI point to where AI goes wrong. Like they'll show, AI, an LLM is not able to do simple mathematics, and that's not what it's meant to do anyway, because it's been trained on language. But my point is that by focusing on this logic of we are getting more and more intelligent, it creates it creates, first of all, this polarity between those who hype it and those who fully dismiss it,
Mm.
that it prevents them from seeing the actual value that these technologies have in the first place.
Right.
And in order to see that value, you need to see how technology in general changes activity and economic and social activity. And
Mm.
that happens when technology becomes a new way to organize social and economic actors, companies, people, and all of our actions in fundamentally new ways. And that's what I mean by coordination. So a very simple way to give an example of that is, and I start the book with this example, is the rise of a technology which we think of as a dumb technology, but how
Mm.
it changed the world in a very big way. It's the shipping container.
Mm.
So back in the 1970s, late 60s, 70s, when the shipping container first came about, people initially thought that the impact of the shipping container would be that ports would get automated, because you had this standardized box. So instead of humans moving cargo up and down, a crane could do that. And today people think about AI in the same way. It's automation, and that was the first order effect of the shipping container. The port got automated, but the real effect of the shipping container
Mm.
came after that, when trucks, trains, and ships agreed to one standard, standardized
Size.
shape and size of the
Mm.
shipping container,
Yeah.
which then made movement of goods reliable between any source and any destination,
Mm.
which then changed the logic of manufacturing. Because before that, every manufacturing company wanted to keep things internal or wanted to keep its suppliers co-located. Now you could have global supply chains, and that led to new winners and losers, not just in terms of which companies came up and which kinds of companies competed, but even in terms of countries, based on how they
Mm.
plugged into these global supply chains and oriented themselves. And I talk about Singapore, where I spent a lot of my life, about how it fully imagined its economy around the rise of the shipping container. And so
Mm.
that really shows, that the benefits of technology play out not through intelligence and cognition that we're talking about, or even through automation, but really through the ability to reorganize activity through a new way to coordinate that activity.
What a great response. Thank you. But many view AI as a thinking machine. Why do you believe this view limits our understanding of its real potential?
Well, I think the challenge with the thinking machine logic is, again, I go back to the point about, do you have a fifth grader in your pocket or a PhD in your pocket? You're constantly trying to compare AI with human intelligence.
Mm.
And even this goal of, let's get to AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is what is driving all this funding and hype. The challenge with that is, even if first of all, it makes us ask the wrong question.
Mm.
Can AI think like us? Is it creative? Is it going to replace humans? These are all the wrong questions, because fundamentally, at the end of the day, AI is a form of technology.
Mm.
It's the smartest technology we've ever had. It
Mm.
has a lot more agency than any other technology we've ever had, because shipping containers, somebody had to move it. There was no agency to that technology.
Correct.
Here, AI has agency,
Mm.
and it can make choices on its own. It can move decisions, take actions on that
Mm.
basis.
Mm.
So we confuse this semblance of agency with the idea that AI, has to think and essentially substitute humans. So I don't think the point of improving AI is to create perfect substitutes for humans
Mm.
or human participation. It's to create perfect substitutes for specific forms of knowledge work. So
Mm.
there's a difference between me as a human and me typing out a summary of an article.
Mm.
AI can create a substitute for that particular activity, But saying that it's a thinking machine that's going to substitute a the thinking capacity of a human is kind of it entirely distracts us from what actually matters. So what matters is to understand that there will be a very important reshuffle in terms of which of us win and lose as AI moves forward. Not all of
Yeah.
us, and not even because we start using AI, there's no guarantee that we'll win, because the only thing that technology guarantees is that eventually what can best be done by AI will be given to AI. What can best be done by humans will be given to humans. Now,
Mm.
what remains with humans,
Mm.
even if they are working alongside AI, does not necessarily mean it's going to be valuable enough to A,
Mm.
support a full job, to B, support a job that has agency, to C, support a job where that you can charge the value that you used to charge in the past. So the the key point that I'm trying to make is that the more we try to keep calling this a thinking machine and keep trying to see evidence of is it performing exactly like a human or not, the more we misunderstand how our economy actually works. So the economy
Mm.
works by allocating labor, by allocating tasks and by managing division of labor to get maximum economic output. That's how it's
Mm.
always worked. With AI, it's going to be the same. And
Yeah.
so the impact is not through direct competition between the two, but where we end up once the reallocation happens.
Mm. Well said. Um, how do AI's five functions, and I picked these from the notes that you had sent to me, sense, model, reason, act, learn, work together to close the coordination gap?
Well, I sort of dumbed it down to say that AI performs these five functions. I mean, depending on how nuanced you want to be, there's a lot of nuance behind it, right?
Mm.
But
Mm.
I wanted to dumb it down to explain to readers that let's demystify what's actually happening.
Mm.
And even though the example that I take to help readers grasp that is that of a technology we use very often, which is GPS based navigation. Now, if
Mhm.
you use something like Google Maps, it's not AI in the sense of how we use AI. It's what is more likely called a rule-based system. So let's not debate on whether Google Maps has some elements of AI or not.
Mm.
Yes, it does, but it's primarily a rule-based system.
Mm.
But the way Google Maps coordinates traffic is very similar to how I believe AI will coordinate and reorganize economic activity. So
Mm.
here's how Google Maps works. It's first of all senses, the environment, which is because of the ability to use GPS to determine which car is where. It
Mm.
models a real-time picture of what's happening. So it obviously has a map, and on top of the map, it overlays, what traffic is building up in which part of the city. On
Mm.
the basis of that model, it then reasons what should be the right path for you. So
Mm.
it determines that path, and then it acts. It gives you turn by turn directions. If you're on a
Mm.
self-driving car, it will actually work with the agency of the car to actually take you there as well. And
Mm.
finally, on the basis of all of this, it constantly learns because everybody is teaching where
Mm.
traffic is building, etc. But the reason all of this is interesting is because when we use Google Maps, we think of it as a single player.
Mm.
We're seeing it's helping us move from point A to point B, but it is actually managing traffic across the whole city in a
Right.
way that even the traffic systems cannot manage. It's
Mm.
rerouting traffic in real time. So that's the idea of coordination. It's rerouting economic activity based on how it sees the world. Now think
Mm.
about AI, and even just think about LLMs as an example. Um, it's again very similar. If you train an LLM based on knowledge in a certain domain, let's say you're let's say we're talking about B2B logistics, and you train LLM
Mm.
based on all the information about knowledge in that particular domain, or even if it's healthcare, you train it on the basis of that. The first thing that the LLM is doing is it's sensing all of that, and then it's modeling a representation of that domain. On
Mm.
the basis of that, it then helps you make better decisions. It helps
Right.
you take action, and then as you plug into a system where that is acting as the brain and you're making decisions and taking action,
Mm.
whatever that system is, that system constantly learns. And so the key point is that all of these technologies, eventually, a simple way to think about it is they create a representation of the world. They constantly sense what's happening, and based
Mm.
on that, they help stakeholders make decisions and take actions. And that's how economic activity is coordinated anyway. So
Mm.
it's a very simplistic way of explaining how to think about AI not as a form of automation but as a new way to reorganize economic activity.
Very interesting. Sangeet, do you see AI reshaping the balance of power between large corporations, governments, and individuals? And if yes, how?
I think it absolutely will, right? And I'll go back to the shipping container
Yeah.
example as well, because it reshaped the balance of power in fundamentally interesting ways. The first thing was that when the shipping container came about, people thought that the jobs at risk were actually the jobs at the port. And that was true. That was the first order effect.
Mm,
But really, the key jobs at risk eventually were the ones that ended up at risk once you went from local and co-located manufacturing to global supply chains, because it was all the manufacturing jobs in the US that went to China. That was the impact of the shipping container.
correct.
And that is where identifying new winners and losers based on first order thinking
Mhm.
makes you miss all the bigger effects that are actually going to happen. So
Yeah.
that's one instance, right? And similarly, old ports and co-located manufacturing facilities like Liverpool went down, new ones like Singapore, which bet on making shipping reliable, not just by creating a better port, but also by creating a better customs clearance and judicial system.
Mhm.
They succeeded. Now, when we think about the landscape of business and work today, let me talk about it at two levels. So let's first talk about the level of the individual, right? At the level of the individual, the way AI creates new winners and losers is
Mm,
that AI's impact plays out not at the level of jobs, but at the level of tasks that constitute a job, right? And when AI starts uh, creating credible substitutes for some of those tasks, certain jobs may not, uh, you know, um, continue to exist in the way they existed in the past. So you would have to reimagine what the new job looks like based on where the new problem in the system is. And
mm,
the issue is not automation. I'll give a simple example from history that illustrates this. So when the word processor was first invented, the job of the typist went away. But the word processor did not automate typing. You and I still type. So typing is
correct.
a human skill. So just because something is a human skill does not mean that the job associated with it will stay back. The
Right.
reason the typist was valued was not because because typing was human and then it stopped being human, but because before the word processor, the cost of managing edits was very high because you had to
Mm,
retype entire documents.
correct.
And hence, skill in typing was highly valued because it reduced the cost for the company. Now, the moment the cost of editing collapsed, as it is today with word processors,
Mm,
skill in typing is not valued anymore. You don't have to
correct.
be a great typist, right? So that's the key point, that the jobs the way jobs get impacted is not because AI comes in and takes over the whole job. It
Mhm.
changes the way, or it changes, most importantly, the assumption on which the previous job was built.
Mm,
So that is the first thing, I would say, at the individual level. If you're trying to think about how the reshuffle will happen, what's the winner loser, think about what are the assumptions on which your job is structured today. What are
mm,
the assumptions on which your career ladder has been structured so far? And do those still exist when AI
mm,
comes in? And I think that's an important piece. And from a business perspective as well, what's important is that one of the direct ways of thinking about the impact of AI is that a lot of knowledge work industries, and every industry today creates value through knowledge work primarily, because even if you look at something like a mining industry,
mm,
even there's a lot of knowledge work, because knowing where to dig and which minerals to extract versus not is what improves ROI on excavation operations. And if you can use AI to improve that, as companies like Earth AI are doing, you improve the ROI on the business. So every business has a knowledge work component. But my key point is that even if we take identifiable industries like professional services, consulting, accounting, law, and so on, these industries have been built on the assumption that knowledge work is expensive because you have to hire somebody from a top college,
mm,
and it's expensive to acquire, and it's expensive to manage because you have to keep training them all the time.
mm,
Now, if these industries are built on these assumptions, and that
mm,
assumption goes away as AI's capabilities increase and knowledge work becomes easier to capture, or to execute, then the traditional balance of power that these industries had with their clients will flip. And we've already
mm,
seen that happening in some ways. A second thing that happens is that when knowledge work, or the capacity to perform knowledge work, moves away from us as humans with our tacit knowledge and goes into a model which can be uncovered with a prompt. That means that knowledge work that was tied inside a particular industry can now be accessible in other industries. So if a model can be trained based on the knowledge in a particular industry and exported and licensed to another industry, new innovation can happen in that industry. So that again changes, how companies win and lose. There are many
Correct.
different ways in which that reshuffle plays out.
Very interesting. Sangeet, I have time for one more question.
Sure.
I was trying to decide what to ask you, but I think what I'd love to get your view on is, technology has often created haves and have-nots
Hmm.
at global levels in countries.
Yeah.
What is your view on AI influencing inequality both within and across nations?
Yeah, this is a very this is a very interesting and pivotal point, at which some of these developments are taking place, because what we've seen ever since the rise of the digital economy is that the digital economy, because of uh, certain factors, first, the fact that it removes a lot of local advantages that people had, because now you participate in global markets. So any local arbitrage you had, because your buyers could not work with suppliers elsewhere and hence you benefited from a local market dynamic, a lot of those things go away with a digital economy. But now, we're not just talking about local markets becoming global markets. We're talking about expensively acquired skills becoming suddenly cheaply accessible, right? So when these kinds of fundamental shifts happen, there is it's bound to increase inequality. And on top of that, we have 30 years of legacy of financialization and then platformization, both of which are basically mechanisms by which the point of value creation and the point at which value gets concentrated and captured are very different. Value is created at societal scale, risk is managed and dispersed across the society, but a few players at the center capture a lot of that value. And AI, I don't see any evidence yet that AI will change, create a dramatically different architecture when the incentives are already towards concentration of wealth and value in that format. So in the current hands, I won't say in the right or wrong hands, but in the current hands of where the power sits today, we will probably see much more extraction. And there are very interesting ways in which some of this extraction also plays out, because a lot of uh, a lot of companies start out with narratives about how they are saving the world or changing the world, and OpenAI started as non-profit, etc. But in general, there's a lot of narrative hype, because uh, we live in an economy where both attention and capital are directed towards hype and towards stories. And so what we often see happening is that this kind of a narrative hype builds commitment from the economy, and then eventually there's a bait and switch that happens. We saw this with social media, where initially the narrative was that we're going to make this egalitarian, and traditional media had gatekeepers, and Arab Spring is coming out of social media, it's making the world a better place. So we talked about how the power structures would fall,
Yeah.
and then what happened was that there were just new power structures that got created, and in many cases, because they had global scale, they had worse effects, and so that is my concern, that in general, even if the new powers are somewhat different, the trend of concentration is only going to increase.
Well said. Well said. And on that note, Sangeet, I just want to say what an amazing conversation this has been. I thought, I do understand very basics of AI. I'm from a very different generation, but talking to you has given me a very interesting perspective on AI. I'm going to get a copy of your book, read it. I'm going to recommend all my viewers and listeners to get a copy of Sangeet Paul Choudhary's book, Reshuffle. Thank you for speaking to me, and all the very best to you.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.